Hello, and welcome to this episode of A Language I Love Is, the podcast that's all about languages, linguistics, and love. I'm your host, Danny, and I'm happy to be back with another episode of the show, this time all about a language that's come back from the dead. To introduce this revived language, my expert guest is Daniel Prohaska. When Daniel is not treading the boards and performing as an opera singer and actor, he's very involved in the modern community of speakers of Cernywec, that is, the Cornish language. It was a pleasure to have him on the show and to hear about the full story of Cornish, from its earliest sources to its extinction and then revival, and also about the challenges that its committed revivalists face today. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the show and leaving a rating or a comment. It's always so nice to get feedback and to know that people out there are listening and enjoying the show.
Nebba's gerio dro the Cernywec. Gyntafas Cernywec yw'n pel gwatnhys as nel yn scant gwetches the well as crafea arta. Cardrig and Zozan i ddanan yn poet ma yn Kenza. Delna mastel the tegi were another hep gara the del her faith was draw the alls and more. Liw of a clap is lebben agustay, with pet no less than gara glows, a two a perhea Howard Ruth, a garta two a helles a Falmouth. And Pona, nitna dew couldna tires and Leicester draw the Higgins will dear, heb his quarter and Pahanter and Leicester na. And tell the ridden ma haggle, mea mwy Zozak clap is drays a Cernywec. That nel bos kevers nel skant clap in a guthas Cernywec, but scantain faith was a war guthas a clap is Oznak.
My guest today brings with him a wealth of information about linguistics and languages of Europe, especially in Western Europe, but actually, linguistics is not his, shall I say, bread and butter. It's not the day job. My guest is Daniel Prohaska, a singer and an actor. He's based in Munich and works specifically in Germany, Austria, but does travel abroad sometimes to perform in other countries. But aside from this, when he is in his rest periods, when he's no longer performing, he has this incredible interest in linguistics. Having previously studied linguistics, Scandinavian studies, English language and literature at university, he's kept up the flame for languages since that time. And I'm just so pleased that I get to talk about one language that he is intimately involved with today. So, Daniel, first things first, thank you so much for joining me. And how are you? How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Now, you, Daniel, you're familiar with the format of this podcast, having listened to a few of the episodes so far. So really, the question that I have to pose to you, as you know at the outset, is what language are we going to be talking about today? So let me frame it in the format of the whole podcast, as the title says. What is a language that you love?
So, yn tafas erficara, hew and Cernywec, Cornish.
Super. Oh, thank you already. Now, we're already getting into nice examples of Cornish, which is fantastic. Now, where to begin with Cornish? I think, at least for all the listeners, let's get familiar with the geography first and foremost of this language. Cornish is associated with Cornwall, but so that we're all on the same page, or the same page of the atlas, where is Cornwall?
So, Cornwall is on the very southwestern tip of the British mainland. It does have the Isles of Scilly associated with it as well, although administratively I think they're now different. But or you know, they've sort of flip-flopped. But it's the southwestern most. It's actually a duchy, but it's administered de facto as a county. So west of Devon. So it's quite a sort of a narrow peninsula. It sort of gets narrower and narrower as it approaches Land's End and the Lizard. And so it's the southwestern tip of Britain, basically.
And the geography will be important to our discussion today. If people can really fix that image in their brains of the extended leg, like a ballet dancer, that leg of Britain jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean, because, well, the geography has a bearing upon the language. Now, people who may know the UK, people may be familiar with Cornwall, they may have visited on holiday. It is an extraordinarily beautiful part of the UK. But if they have been, they probably won't odds are they probably won't have heard any Cornish. So what is the status of the Cornish language today?
Well, the Cornish language is interesting in that sense, is that like many minority languages that were under pressure from a very dominant and strong language in its vicinity, lost a battle of survival. Cornish became extinct as a community language around 1800. So one of the most fascinating aspects of Cornish today is that it's a revived language. Around 1900, and this is Henry Jenner, who is considered the father of the Cornish language revival, published his book, A Handbook of the Cornish Language, and kick-started this revival that's been going on for 120 years now. Various generations have taken it on to learn the language and promote the language, and so it's back from the dead, and this is a fascinating characteristic in the first place. So I think that's one thing. But of course, the number of speakers is relatively small, so we always sort of look with envy towards the most successful revived language, which is probably Ivrit, modern Hebrew, with millions of native speakers now. Cornish hasn't had this amount of success, but you can say there are fluent speakers of Cornish. There are even neo-native speakers of Cornish, few in number, but there are some, who were children of revivalists and were brought up bilingually with Cornish and English. But there's no one particular geographic area in Cornwall where you can say there's a community of speakers. So Cornish speakers actively have to meet. There are networks of peoples. And of course, modern communication makes this a lot easier, especially if you consider people outside of Cornwall, like me, who have learnt Cornish and who interact with the revivalist community. But no, I think it's just a fascinating feature that it was possible to bring a language back from the dead, which was basically spoken before there were any recording devices, so we really had to bring it back from the written language and from dialect survivals within the English Cornish dialect as well, and place names, of course, and things like that. So yeah. So it does have a reconstructing aspect to it, but that shouldn't devalidate its existence, because it's sort of got its own dynamic back by now.
And when you say the written records, when are these written records from? What is the revived Cornish based on as a language today?
So it's based on basically the entire history of the written Cornish language. So we have a few names from the 10th century. We have Latin, Old English, Cornish glossary from the 12th, 13th century, probably the late 12th century, maybe mid-13th century. That's the sort of time range. They don't know exactly when that was made. But the Old English in this glossary still has a very oldish sense to it. So it hasn't really made the transition to Middle English. So it's likely around the late 12th century, something like that. Then we have a number of texts, mainly religious passion and mystery plays, from the 14th to 16th centuries. That's quite a body of literature. So we have a firm body of literature for Middle Cornish, and then you sort of have this transitional period in the 16th century to a more sort of modern, evolved form of Cornish, usually referred to as Late Cornish, as the latest stage of the language development, where you have a longish morality tale, letters, some translations from the Gospels, excerpts, not the whole Bible and not the whole Gospels, but still a number of excerpts, personal letters, numbers, then dialect survivals and stuff like this. So there is a decent amount of literature. There's also, from this transitional period in the late 16th centuries, you have a whole bunch of homilies, which is basically the longest texts we have in Cornish in prose, because the earlier writings were mainly in verse. So the prose texts, of course, give us a better impression of the spoken word.
And so let's then situate all of this within its history. Everything you've just outlined sounds like the Cornish is doing okay. Like it has this thriving written culture. We're getting documents in Cornish. So what happens? Why does Cornish decline? Could you take us through its general story? Is it fair to say that Cornish retreats down the peninsula of Devon and Cornwall, that it goes further and further west into where it's spoken? How does that process of retreating in the face of English begin, and when does it begin?
Well, it basically begins with Anglo-Saxon settlement in Britain. So British languages, and we don't really know too much about what happened in these settlement areas because we have very little British of the time surviving in that area, but we know there were British speakers. There were probably Latin speakers as well in the towns and villas. So it would have been a very Romanized society, and which is why the Anglo-Saxons called them the Welsh, Romanized people, mainly Romanized Celts. But the western part of Britain would have sort of been more Celtic and held on to the various dialects of the British language, which eventually developed into Welsh, and the southwestern variety, which was then also transferred across the Channel into Brittany. So the language that is most closely related to Cornish is actually Breton. Welsh is a little bit further away, but Breton and Cornish form this sort of southwestern branch of the British languages. And this retreat was gradual over the centuries of Anglo-Saxon expansion into the southwest. So when the former kingdom of Dumnonia was conquered, and the border between Cornwall and Devon was basically settled in the 10th century, when the Tamar became the border river between Cornwall and Devon. There's a part of northeastern Cornwall which was also English settled, so you will have a lot of English place names there. But apart from that, the majority of place names in Cornwall are Cornish or British. You can really see the sort of temporal progression. And then there was still pressure from English, but of course the Norman conquests stopped that to a certain degree, stopped the strong English encroachment with William the Conqueror using a lot of Breton nobility to rule over Cornwall. So there was probably a connection there, and there might have actually been a reinforcing of the Cornish language through that. But then as time progresses, probably moving from east to west, more and more places became bilingual, but Cornish still held on in the east for a long time. So there wasn't a kind of a continual progression from east to west. There was probably more bilingual areas, the number of Cornish speakers reducing, whereas in the west it stayed strongest for the longest time. And then there were just occurrences in English history, like the War of the Roses, where there was a Cornish rebellion, and then later on, after the English prayer book was introduced, so Protestantization of a mainly Catholic Cornish population, they had a larger rebellion in 1547, where actually a Cornish army marched upon London and was absolutely slaughtered. And the revenge of the English was quite harsh, and they reckon that at least 15 to 20% of the male population were slaughtered. So that was quite a blow to the Cornish language. And then ties to Brittany also became fewer after the Reformation. And that's when basically the dynamics of the collapse of the language area increased. So throughout the late 16th, then throughout the 17th century, then you have a sort of a large collapse of Cornish speaking, I'd say up west into past Truro, and then you basically only had it in the Penwith and Lizard peninsulas in the 17th century. And then by 1800, we reckon Cornish was no longer used as a community language in these very far western areas. There are reports of people throughout the 19th century who still had traditional knowledge of Cornish. How far that went, we don't know, because there's hardly any written documentation. But there are some dialect survivals up until the early 20th centuries. There were fishermen in Newlyn who could still count in Cornish. They counted their fish in Cornish traditionally, used certain phrases, but the language itself was mostly defunct.
I have to ask, really, Cornwall today, in terms of language, might be lumped together with the West Country, this general term that we use in England to refer to the counties and the accents of the southwest. But is that fair? Is Cornish English today different to the other West Country dialects? And could some of these differences actually be a legacy of Cornish?
It's difficult to say. There's been some research into that. What we can say about the east of Cornwall is that's definitely some form of continuation of the southwest dialect-wise. So you still have strongish southwestern dialects in the east of Cornwall, at least up until the past few generations. The younger generations are sort of very southeasternized in some cases. But you find a huge diversity of accents in Cornwall, especially from people having moved in, but also influences from the southeast. But you still have a lot of dialect speakers still. In the west, the dialect was also southwestern in general character, but it was much more based on the features that were also part of standard English of the, let's say, 16th and 17th century, which to our modern ears would probably sound southwestern because those are the more conservative varieties. But Cornwall in the west, so where Cornish was spoken the longest, has features of this older standard English. And that's quite interesting because, and that was also historically commented on, that contemporaries kind of said, yeah, in the West they speak beautiful English. They probably learnt the standard English from interacting with local nobility or people who sort of spoke more elevated English rather than learning the dialect by word of mouth from dialect speakers which sort of encroach from the east. So you do have linguistic differences in the English of Cornwall. But to really say, apart from loan words from Cornish into the dialect, to say there is a strong influence of the Cornish language on English, I would probably say no. Maybe still in the 18th and 19th centuries where you might have had features of intonation and stuff like that, but that's sort of largely been swamped, or at least from an academic standpoint, very difficult to determine what exactly is that and what is a feature of the English, what might have come from Cornish. But as far as loan words go, yes, we have dialect words that are definitely of Cornish origin, and yes.
That is fascinating, absolutely fascinating, to pose this question of where and from whom specifically the Cornish are getting their English. They're not necessarily getting it from their eastern Cornwall neighbours and from people in Devon. They're actually getting it sort of from on top, from people higher up in society who have this say elite English.
Yes, also merchants, of course, who would have been well travelled and would have had a more standard pronunciation, or easier to understand pronunciation, probably would have avoided very strong dialectalisms and stuff like that. So I think they sort of learned the English of the better people rather than the English dialects encroaching from the east.
Understood. So the picture is complicated, and this is utterly fascinating, but we're not here to talk about Cornish English, we're here to talk about Cornish specifically. We must stress, to be clear, Cornish is a Celtic language. More specifically, it is an insular Celtic language, more specifically a Brythonic Celtic language, along with Welsh and Breton. So can I assume that there is all sorts of very different features about Cornish that really mark it out as an insular Celtic language? We've got things like verb, subject, object order, for example, mutations that people may know from Welsh. What's that like in Cornish?
Yes, that's also the case in Cornish. So Cornish is very Celtic in character as far as the Neo-Celtic languages go, as well as as far as the British Celtic languages go. So you will find a main sentence structure of VSO, verb, subject, object, although there's a kind of a newly developed subject, verb, object system which derives from a relative construction, an emphasized relative construction. So, for example, it would be very Celtic to say, Acaravadhavas Cornuach, I love the Cornish language. This would be quite unusual in a sentence outside the verbal forms of bos, to be. So you would rather say, Mi gar and Tavas Cornuach, which is basically a subject, or looks like a subject verb object construction, but it's actually based on an old relative construction. where the literal translation would be something like, "It is I who loves the Cornish language." So that became a kind of a new model for the affirmative statement. Basically, you find all the sort of verb first constructions again then in other relative clauses and in negative statements and stuff. So they go back to the VSO then. You have mutations, which are basically a feature of historical phonology. So you have, for example, in the Old British language, the consonants PTK, the plosives, they all lenited, they softened to bdg. But this also occurred in the Celtic languages across the word boundaries. So they will have softened, depending on what the ending was in British, they would have softened the following word. Then the endings in British dropped, and these softened consonants at the beginning became, or sometimes they were aspirated, sometimes they were nasalized, so you have all these different sets of mutations according to the old British endings, which dropped off, and then the softening or the initial change of the consonants or the initial consonants became grammaticalized, so that you end up with these sets of grammaticalized mutations that you also find in all the Neo-Celtic languages, also the Goidelic languages, Irish Manx and Scottish Gaelic. So Cornish has that. Cornish has conjugated prepositional pronouns. So to me would be one word, them. To you or to thee, second person singular would be these. So you also have the feature of a kind of a lack of a single verb that means to have. Usually there are phrases with be to something. So I have a book, for example, would be me lever them. There is a book to me. There's also an older sort of a fossilized dative construction where you could say lever and bears with an infixed pronoun, and sometimes the verb cowers, to find, was used as a kind of a supplement, conveying the idea of having. So yeah, these are some features of Cornish, some grammatical features which make it very characteristically Celtic.
One question that occurred to me was, do we know who the last speaker or the last native speaker of Cornish was before its extinction?
Well, according to legend, it was Dolly Pentraeth, who lived in Mousehole and I think died in the late 1780s. But we have one basically written recording of a Cornish speaker who survived Dolly. We also have somebody writing an epitaph for Dolly's grave, who must have survived her and knew Cornish. And we have these reports by word of mouth of people in the 19th century who still knew Cornish, one of them even into the early 20th century, so overlapping with the revival. So there is this idea, or let's say romantic fancy of a certain continuation of Cornish, although I don't think this is really true. I think the revived Cornish is really separate in that, of course, it took all these influence and dialect words and survivals into it, but there wasn't really a continuation. But so we don't know exactly who the last competent, fluent native Cornish speaker was, but we can sort of say that around the year 1800 it ceased as a community language, at least, with certain individuals still having knowledge of it throughout the 19th century.
Right, okay. And I'm particularly keen to dig into this general picture that you very nicely painted for us, going way, way back, emerging out of sort of sub-Roman, late antique Britain, where all these different dialects, or just one language, the British language, when it was yet to break up. And what it sounds like, from what you've told us, is that we have a kind of, the connections between different groups of British speakers are being cut. So first we have the connection to Welsh, that's cut, I think, with the traditionally, I think, ascribed to one particular battle, which the early Welsh and early Cornish lost. But then you have this idea, really interesting, much later, of the connection between Cornish and Breton being severed. Now, that's going to have consequences, the fact that these languages are no longer in communication. To your ear or to the ear of the general revived Cornish-speaking community, what are Welsh and Breton like today? Have they really diverged from that early medieval point in time?
Oh, of course they have. Of course, Welsh is as a language with a strong literary tradition, has strong connections in the language to the past as well, especially when forming its standard language, its literary variety, which is sort of very heavily influenced, of course, by the Welsh Bible translations of the 15th and 16th centuries. So they have this very, very strong literary tradition that while the spoken dialects have progressed and modernized and developed, the connection to the past is still very strong, whereas I think in Breton you have the characteristic that is very, very dialectally split. You have several literary traditions, one from the northwest and one from the southeast, which are linguistically quite far apart. So there's less unity. In Wales you had this sort of real literary connecting language between the dialects of the north and the dialects of the south, which of course went their own way to a certain degree, but they had this unifying character of the literary language. Cornish probably didn't have this so much. It's a much smaller area than both Wales and Brittany, so we don't really know about the dialectal diversity of Cornish in its historical period. There is variation, we see that in the texts, but we don't know who wrote what from where, so we can't assign them to areas. We can see a few isoglosses if we look at place names, but it's very difficult to sort of say, okay, this is where there's one Cornish dialect area and where there's another. You can see a progression of the development of the Cornish language from east to west. So the eastern place names tend to have older linguistic forms than the western forms. So the west kind of changed along with the development of the language, whereas the areas that gave up Cornish in the east would have frozen these older linguistic features in time. So one very, very characteristic feature of Cornish that distinguishes Cornish from both Breton and Welsh is so-called assimilation. That means that a historical d sound was assimilated, became z and then z. Sometimes, in some cases, palatalized to j, probably around the 11th, 12th century. So we see in this old Cornish vocabulary, we really see a transitional time of this sound change taking place, because some historical Ds show assimilation and some don't. And that's quite fascinating. And we see this in the progression of the place names as well, from east to west. So we see these linguistic developments, but it's very difficult to sort of say, okay, was this a dialect area? Was a vowel pronounced differently here? There certainly were differences, but it's very difficult to assign them to a given area, because we don't know where the scribes of the texts came from and what they wrote and what they copied. So that's quite complicated. There's also another very interesting feature in Late Cornish, so-called pre-occlusion, where the former geminate or fortis consonants m or n had a pre-occlusive element. So, for example, mother in Welsh is mam and head is pen. And in Cornish, it eventually became mabm and pedden. So you have this sort of homogenic occlusion before the bilabial nasal and then the alveolar nasal. So and mabm, pedden. But there is variety in modern revived Cornish, because one very important thing to know about the revival is that there was quite a bit of disagreement and flip-flopping on which area to focus on. Do you focus on the language where it left off, on the latest period, or do you go back to the heyday of the literary Middle Cornish period? And there have always been varying opinions on that. So when Henry Jenner started the Cornish revival in the early 20th century, he was basically looking at the language in its latest stage, incorporating earlier features as well, but mainly focusing on the language where it left off. And then his student, Morton Nance, who became very influential in the revival movement, sort of doubled back and went right back into the Middle Cornish period and based the revived language on that. So nowadays we have this sort of dichotomy of these two varieties, one progressive and one conservative, and it's quite fascinating to see the dynamics there, because for a while Middle Cornish took over very strongly, and it's still by far, let's say, the strongest focus of most revivalists and learners is on the Middle Cornish period, and the revived Cornish that was then based on the Middle Cornish period. But revived Late Cornish really had a comeback in the 70s and 80s with Richard Gendall, who was a long-time Cornish teacher and performer, songwriter, who then focused more strongly on the Late Cornish. So you have these two dynamics within the revival with differing pronunciations, slightly different grammar. So you will have a more conservative grammar, of course, in the Middle Cornish-based varieties, and a more modern sort of Neo-Celtic feel in the Late Cornish-based varieties, much as you can see, for example, in Wales, with people preserving the old literary standard. And I think that sort of works well for language stratification as well, that you have the later forms as a kind of racy, colloquial kind of way of speaking, and the more Middle Cornish forms as a literary form that you would write in or write poetry in or stuff like that.
And within these modern efforts then, do you have, for example, a lot of English influences coming in, or alternatively, do you have a lot of, say, calking, where people are translating loan words into Cornish elements? So what's the relationship? I imagine that Middle Cornish didn't have a word for, say, computer or podcast. So what does revived Cornish do in these cases?
It does a number of things. So people pop out with all these kind of words, then this gets sort of incorporated into the community, and then over time then one or two forms win out. Of course, Middle Cornish didn't have a word for computer, but you had one for calculating and reckoning and accounting and stuff like that. So a lot of these computer words are based on those things, like Reckner, or you have a Montier. You have strong Anglo-Norman influence, possibly through Middle Cornish, on the Cornish language as well. So you've got all these words. Some are very sort of purist in form, only with Cornish Celtic roots. Others sort of take a broader approach and sort of incorporate the attested Middle English and Anglo-Norman loan words as well. So there are different approaches, and you will have differing words for modern concepts, and then over time one of them or two will win out and sort of gain usage in the community. Of course, English influence is found on all levels of the language, whether it's pronunciation. Of course, a lot of people speak with English sound substitutions, basically use their English spoken variety and equate them with Cornish sounds and then use them. So there are a couple of problematic areas where sounds that would have been distinct in historical Cornish have fallen together, like O sounds, for example. So Cornish had an O diphthong, but it also had an O. And sometimes in the mouth of an English speaker, they will sort of coalesce into one O, something like that. But others are sort of very strict in maintaining these differences as well. So you find a lot of variety among the speakers in the community. Some sort of go for a more Welsh pronunciation. Others will base their sounds heavily on traditional Western Cornish, English Cornish dialect features. So you have a whole range of pronunciation, and so this our lack of knowledge about the historic spoken Cornish language is both a curse as well as a blessing. So it's a curse in the fact that the linguist always wants to know how exactly that was pronounced and what pronunciation model to follow, but it's a blessing for a lot of learners, because there's a lot of freedom in pronouncing these words, and nobody really there to say, oh no, that's wrong, although there are always plenty of people. I also give myself a mea culpa here for saying, oh no, that's wrong. that could never have been the case, and stuff like that. You know how picky historical linguists can get sometimes, and also argue among themselves about what could have been right or wrong. But that's also done in friendly jest. And I always see, you know, where there are certain arguments about or nitpicking about certain aspects of Cornish, we always learn more. That's the wonderful thing. The more you look into something, the more you learn. And, you know, sometimes you just have to say to yourself, okay, this is just something we will probably never be able to know. For example, like how to pronounce the consonant R in Cornish. Was it a R? Was it a R? Was it a R? Or, you know, whatever it was it a R? We don't know. And it's probably going to be impossible ever to tell what it was without, you know, the help of a time machine, which of course is something that I would very much appreciate having, to be able to look into historical Cornish as it was spoken. But the community is vibrant, enthusiastic, and enjoys all these things, and you basically find someone for all flavours. So that's a nice aspect of it.
Wonderful. And there are occasionally chances to meet up and use Cornish in real life together, isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. There are at least 1 or 2 pub nights somewhere in Cornwall per week. There are Cornish language weekends. There's the Cornish Gorsedd, which is basically the equivalent to the Welsh Gorsedd, where the bards meet, but there are also language activities, language classes, taster sessions for new learners. And the wonderful thing about the Cornish language community is that they're so welcoming. They're so grateful for people actually showing an interest in Cornish and wanting to learn it and pick it up, that there's a great amount of enthusiasm and help to these new learners who come into the community, and it's very easy to find new friends and new social connections and stuff like that. And that's really something quite wonderful about the Cornish community, that it's so welcoming and so open, not just to people in Cornwall who want to learn Cornish, but worldwide, you know, and especially through modern technology, through Zoom and other online media, we can just talk to each other there. So there are also these meetings are called Dydh and Werin, so it's language of the people, and they're basically Cornish language sessions, meetups, and there are now online Dydh and Werins as well. So that's also great for the diaspora, or for people who live outside Cornwall and want to keep in touch and use and practice the language.
So, Dan, you have clearly demonstrated what an expert you are in the Cornish language, in the full context of the Cornish language and indeed of the linguistics of Western Europe. But as I introduced you at the beginning, this is not your day job. You know, you are an opera singer. That's what you've been doing recently. You've been in rehearsals, and now you're enjoying some holiday and some time off. So can you explain for the listeners, how do the two come together or not come together? What is your relationship with the Cornish language, and how does it occupy your life today?
Oh, wow. Huge question. As far as my artistic and musical background go, I come from a family of theatre people. My grandfather was a conductor, my sister's a singer, my mother was a singer, my dad studied to be a singer but then worked as an opera director. So I have this kind of thing in my family that I probably try to get away from. I sort of jokingly call it the family curse, that I sort of in my late teens and early 20s wanted to get away from by actually studying linguistics and Scandinavian studies and English language and lit. Those were my main subjects at the Vienna University in the 90s. And I really, really enjoyed doing that. But through, you know, life happens when you're busy making other plans. So I bumped into an old schoolmate of mine who, you know, we did school theatre together, school drama, and he said, well, he's doing the entrance exam at the Vienna Conservatoire for musical theatre, and I should tag along because, you know, I always loved doing theatre and stuff. So I said, yeah, I'll give it a try. I wasn't really fully convinced because I was actually enjoying my studies so much. But then out of, you know, about 150 applicants, they took 8 people, and I was one of them. So I suddenly had this dilemma of you know, being accepted into this school that a lot of people wanted to get into. So I kind of said, okay, I'll give it a go. I'll give it a shot. And then stuck with it because, you know, my old theatre passion took over. But linguistics never sort of left my mind. And that was also the period when I sort of started getting very interested in Cornish as well. So that was always something that was there on the side, and there was a connection to Cornwall. I'm not from Cornwall myself. I'm Austrian. My dad's Austrian. My mother's British of Irish origin. She grew up in Manchester, won a scholarship, the Tower Scholarship to study in Vienna, met my dad, and the rest is history. So again, that has to do with theatre. But while she was actually training to studying to become a teacher, she worked 2 consecutive summers in Cornwall and stayed with a family that she befriended, and they've stayed in touch ever since. And of course we went there on holidays and stuff like that. So I did have a connection to Cornwall, and was eventually fascinated, sort of when looking into my linguistic studies, that there was a traditional historical language of Cornish. So I started looking into that, and of course we didn't have YouTube in those days, so I had no clue how to pronounce this. I only saw it on paper, bought a book on it, and then in my next Cornwall trip I actually looked up aforementioned Richard Gendall, who was a teacher of Cornish, and we spent a whole afternoon together, and I was just absolutely stricken with this language and the way he spoke it, and the way he and these sounds that came out. Because what I'd actually heard of Cornish always sounded, how did my cousin who lives in Cornwall in St Austell, he kind of says, because I asked him why doesn't he ever learn Cornish, he said, well, to me it just sounds like a bunch of Cornish place names pronounced by an English person. Which is harsh, but I knew what he meant. And then, but hearing Richard Gendall, I suddenly heard a rich language in its own right, and was absolutely fascinated. So I took up learning the language. I got all his material, his course books, we still work with audio cassettes there, so got all these cassettes and listened to them and started learning the language. And as I progressed, I also, of course, looked into the history of the language, and my interest for historical linguistics came in handy there. Slowly, as you do in the revival, you sort of progress from learner to teacher, because you want to pass on, and since the speaker community is so small, you want to sort of pass on what you've learned to other people as well. And I ended up being one of the linguistics advisors to the panel that set up the standard written form of Cornish, which came about in 2008. Because there was a bit of a strife going on beforehand about which particular orthography to use, which is something that lots of minority languages go through. You know, that have older writing systems vying with new ones, and more traditional ones with more accurate ones in the linguistic sense. And Cornish was quite particular there, because there was a kind of a 3-part split between the orthographies, one sort of which was sort of very heavily based on English orthography of the 17th century for late Cornish. Then you had the sort of standardized middle Cornish, and then you had a kind of a newly developed middle Cornish phonemic variety, and those 3 were kind of vying for dominance, and this was then settled with the new standard written form, which allows for a lot of internal variation, which is also quite good for the varieties that are around. So I started doing a lot of lexicographical work once that was set up, because of course the new orthography had no dictionary, so I started writing a dictionary, which of course is a task that you never finish. So I'm on 5,000 pages and still working on it, and probably will never see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I'm also working for the Cornish Academy on the terminology panel, and we standardise and come up with words and for new concepts. We were currently working on computer terminology. Now, I don't know how important it is to have those in Cornish, but a lot of Cornish speakers are very adamant at wanting to use Cornish words rather than English words, so they just don't want to take over the English words. So we kind of give them options to use Cornish words.
That's wonderful. And you're so involved then. You are not only an appreciator, a lover of Cornish, but you are playing a part in its future too. You're shaping the direction of Cornish in the year 2024. Are you hopeful for the future of Cornish?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, the enthusiasm and love for the language in the community is so great. But of course, we have to look at demographics and how the language is passed on. So it's only very, very rarely passed on as a native language, with parents being sufficiently fluent enough in the language so that they can actually raise their kids through Cornish. A few have succeeded, but many times it's people who are retired who then have enough time to spend their lives learning Cornish and interacting with the community. Because when you're having a life, when you've got to make ends meet, earn your living, have kids and stuff like that, it's very difficult to sort of undertake a huge project like learning a language. And learning a revived language is another issue, because you haven't really got a speaker community that you can immerse yourself in for quick learning. This is real sort of groundbreaking work that it can be quite a slog if you're not a sort of a practiced language learner. So I understand the difficulties there. But as I said, there's so much enthusiasm and help from the community that I'm sort of confident we can expand the number of speakers, of users. Whether this will actually lead into ever being able to found a community which is mainly Cornish speaking and from which the language can spread, I'm skeptical, but this would be a huge project. I mean, Cornish isn't in the same position as, for example, Ivrit Hebrew was in the early days of Israel, because you had so many different people coming in from different regions of the earth speaking so many different languages. In Cornish, you already have a lingua franca. In Cornwall, you have English. Everybody speaks English. So and English is a world-dominating language. So it's very, very difficult to sort of come up against that and sort of establish your own community. But I mean, it is growing. It's becoming more and more visible in Cornwall, with more and more businesses using Cornish names, Cornish brand names, street signs. There's a huge project going on to have bilingual place names and street names. So you do have a lot of work going in there. It's becoming more and more visible, and there is a greater uptake. So we have a larger amount of learners. I think even the fluent speakers have vastly increased in the past 20 years. So I think they've almost doubled, I'd say. So there was a survey done in the early 2000s where you ended up between 300 and 350 fluent speakers who really speak Cornish daily. And this is easily gone up to over 500 now, but with learners in different ranges and different stages of language acquisition, from a simple conversation to a more elaborate conversation, or sometimes just a few phrases, but sort of progressing constantly in the thousands. So I'd say there are at least 2,000-3,000 people learning Cornish at the moment. Of course, they won't all become fluent, but there's a good chance that quite a number of them will.
Now then, it's time for question number 2, which I pose to all of my guests, which is, what is something that you love about this language? Give us a little nugget of Cornish information, please.
So this is always one of the questions which I love about your podcast as well, where everybody sort of says, oh, but I love this as well, and I love this. And so it's awfully hard to sort of pick out one little bit. I don't really know whether this is my absolute one favourite bit about Cornish, but it's an example of something I would absolutely love about the Cornish language, and that's the third person plural pronoun in revived late Cornish, and of course in late Cornish, which is anjay. Anjay. It means they. You can say, they love Cornish, anjay yagar kernuap. It's interesting because it's actually a fusion of a third person plural verbal ending with the old third person pronoun, which in Middle Cornish was e, which became diphthongized in Late Cornish to and the ending, the verbal ending, was uns. And this the N sort of palatalize the Z sound, and you get all these different features which are very typical of the late Cornish, united in this one pronoun, which is why I chose it. So it's the old verbal ending uns with the old pronoun I, and that became its own pronoun, and J.
So this is a case then of rebracketing, of listeners chopping up words in new ways and separating them out. The same thing that sort of happened with hamburger into burger and helicopter into helipad. Is that what's going on here then?
Stuff like that, exactly. It's not a reduction, it's actually an addition, because I would actually be absolutely fine as a third-person pronoun and is also attested, so it was used. But this sort of became an emphatic form to incorporate the ending of the verb that, of course, comes before the pronoun in a VSO language. So that's also has this kind of characteristic incorporated into this one word, which is why it sort of incorporates my favourite brand and idea of Cornish in this one word.
Of course, the third and final question from me, which I pose to all my guests, is simply, the episode is ending. What is something that you want the audience to know about Cornish as they go out into the world so much better informed about this revived language?
The one thing I want people to know, it's not dead. It's not just still here, it's here again. And I hope it's here to stay, because it's growing, as we said. And it's also one thing that a lot of people say, it's a revived language, it's some artificial reconstruction. Yes, there is some reconstructive element to it. There's also some artificiality to it, but that's true of any language, and that's really something which just puts it in line with many other languages. But it's firmly based on the traditional written language of Cornwall. It is, in every sense of its word, the Cornish language. Of course, is a revived form, especially where the sort of native transmission of the language has ceased at a certain point and taken back up again. It is a different beast than the original traditional language, but this is true of other revived languages as well, even of revitalised languages, where revitalising efforts are ongoing while traditional native speakers are still alive. We have that case in Irish and Breton, for example, but I'm sure also in certain American languages, Australian languages. I've heard there are also cases, Hawaiian, stuff like that, where you say, okay, there are still traditional native speakers, but there's also a revitalising effort, and there are linguistic differences which are typical of these revitalised and revived languages. You know, what is often said in the media, it's dead, it's useless, it's expensive to invest money in it, it's a hobby. Those are negative attitudes that you probably can't really do away with, but I think there is a more important aspect to it, and that is very much felt within the community, is the strong connection to Cornwall, to the history of Cornwall, to the identity of being Cornish, of having this traditional language, of reclaiming this linguistic past, which is important to a lot of people, be they from Cornwall or have moved to Cornwall or even outside of Cornwall or have Cornish roots or stuff like that, or just interested in Celtic language. There's so many ways to come to the Cornish language and experience the joy of learning this truly wonderful language. And I hope I can help in promoting it and having fun with it and interacting with a wonderfully welcoming community.
Well, you've successfully enthused me, and I think I can speak for everyone listening that the enthusiasm and the love, the welcome of that community are obvious. Well, let's say that the people listening would like to make a start on their personal journey into Cornish. Where should they start? What would be your recommendation for getting stuck into Cornish?
Well, because most of us are old folk, we're still on Facebook mainly, so you can find several Cornish groups on Facebook. There are classes throughout Cornwall that you can visit. There are now many online classes as well. I have a website where I teach my particular brand of late Cornish-based Cornish, so that's one possibility. There are many, many others who teach a sort of a more middle Cornish or a middle ground between the two. So there are plenty of possibilities. Just browse the internet and you'll come across the Cornish Language Board, the Cornish Language Society, and various other organisations that will be happy to point you in the right direction to find a class or a learning environment that is suited to you.
So much good information there. Just, you are clearly immersed in the whole world of Cornish. And honestly, just thank you so much for sharing all of that expertise and all of that enthusiasm with us today. Dan, on behalf of everyone listening, and absolutely from me, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
No, thank you. It was a great pleasure to talk about these things. And, I've been listening to your podcast for a while and I really enjoyed them. Also, the enthusiasm from all the other language lovers, and the fact that you have language and love, nice alliteration, by the way, in the title of your podcast was something that really triggered me, because for me, Cornish, it's like a long, ongoing love affair that has never become old. It's always fresh. And sometimes it wanes a little, but then it comes back with a vengeance. It's a wonderful thing. And I thought your podcast was very inspiring, which is why I contacted you to say, I've got a language that I love that I want to talk about. So now I've done it, and you've given me the platform and the opportunity to do that. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
I'm very glad that you did. To bring this cornucopia of Cornish content to a close, my final fun fact concerns probably the most important substance in the history of Cornwall. The fortunes of that part of Britain were historically intertwined with the chemical element of tin. Cornwall was one of the few reliable sources of tin in Europe, and really it put Britain on the ancient world's map, being the only thing about this peripheral island that really was of interest to the various peoples around the Mediterranean. Vast trade routes existed to transport Cornish tin to them and allow them to create bronze. The metal reached as far as the Levant, as evidenced by tin ingots found in a shipwreck off the coast of Israel and dated to the 13th or 12th centuries BC. The Greek historian Herodotus also mentions the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, a place of very unclear origin, but possibly a reference to Britain, or Ireland, or the Scilly Isles, or somewhere in the neighbourhood. Cornwall's role in the trade may have influenced vocabulary too. The Latin for tin is stannum, hence the element's chemical symbol, SN. It's a rare word in classical Latin sources and doesn't seem to mean tin at first. Its origins are unclear, but it could be a word adopted from the Celtic languages. The Cornish for tin is stein, and it's storn in Irish. This etymology would make geographical sense, given the peoples involved in getting tin to the Romans. Alternatively, the word may have gone in the other direction. Stannum might come from a metallic meaning of the ancient Greek word stagorn, usually meaning a drop, and then it was the Romans who passed their word stannum on to the Britons. I do sort of hope that the first theory, the Celtic origin, is the correct one, as it would allow for a Cornish contribution to the periodic table. So, that's your lot for this episode of A Language I Love Is. If you've enjoyed this episode, again, please do subscribe and give the show a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Heartfelt thanks go to my guest today, Daniel Prohaska, but also to you, dear listener, for listening along. Keep well and keep loving language.